I was invisible behind the cash register at Romano's Market. Just another face in a sea of minimum wage workers scanning barcodes and bagging groceries in the heart of Brooklyn. My name is Sofia Marino, 27 years old, and I'd been ringing up overpriced tomatoes and day-old bread for 3 years, ever since I'd arrived in America with nothing but a suitcase and dreams that had long since crumbled into the reality of survival. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with a frequency that gave me headaches, and the linoleum floor was cracked in places where shopping carts had worn away the pattern over decades. My uniform was a polyester nightmare, red vest over white shirt, name tag crooked because the pin had broken months ago and management never replaced it. My hands were dry from scanning products all day, my feet ached in the cheap sneakers I couldn't afford to replace, and my soul felt like it was slowly being crushed under the weight of a life that had promised so much more. I'd grown up in a village outside Naples, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the streets were cobblestone and ancient, where you could smell the sea salt in the air and hear church bells marking time that moved slowly, purposefully. My grandmother had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 6, filling my head with stories of America as a land of opportunity, a place where hard work meant success, where someone like me could build a life beyond the limitations of a small Italian village. She'd worked her whole life cleaning houses for wealthy families, saving every spare lira and then euro, and when she died just after my 24th birthday, she left me enough money for a plane ticket and 3 months' rent in New York. "Come to America," her letter had said, in her shaky handwriting. "Make the life I never could. Make me proud." 3 years later, I was making $9.50 an hour, living in a studio apartment in Bensonhurst, with 2 other women who worked similar dead-end jobs, eating pasta with butter most nights because anything else was too expensive, and sending what little I could save back to my cousin in Italy who was raising his 3 children alone after his wife left. The American dream, it turned out, was reserved for people with connections, education, and luck. I had none of those things. What I did have was fluency in Italian, English, that still carried a heavy accent despite my efforts, and a work ethic that meant I never called in sick, even when I probably should have. The customers at Romano's Market were mostly Italian Americans, 2nd and 3rd generation, who came in looking for ingredients that reminded them of heritage they'd mostly forgotten. They'd ask me questions in broken Italian, mangling pronunciation in ways that made me want to correct them. But I'd learned early that Americans didn't appreciate being corrected, even when they were butchering my language. So I smiled, nodded, helped them find the right pasta or cheese or olive oil, and took their money while dying a little inside at each mispronounced word. It was a Thursday in late September, the kind of day where the heat of summer was finally breaking into something resembling autumn, when everything changed. I was working the express lane, running through the mechanical motions of scan, bag, total, payment, receipt, next customer, the rhythm so ingrained I could do it half asleep. The store was moderately busy, usual afternoon crowd of elderly women buying ingredients for dinner, and young mothers with toddlers grabbing snacks and milk. Then he walked in, and the atmosphere in the store shifted so subtly that most people probably didn't notice. But I noticed. I'd grown up in Italy, where men like him were both feared and respected, where certain families commanded silence with their presence. He was maybe 45, wearing a suit that probably cost more than I made in 6 months, charcoal gray with a subtle pinstripe, perfectly tailored to his broad shoulders and trim waist. His shoes were Italian leather. I could tell from 20 feet away, the kind of shoes my grandfather had made by hand in his workshop before arthritis stole his craft. His hair was dark, with just a touch of silver at the temples, swept back in that way Italian men have perfected, and his face was all sharp angles and controlled intensity. 2 men flanked him, both built like they spent their lives in gyms, wearing suits that didn't quite fit as well, hands never far from their jackets in a way that screamed security. The man in the middle, the one who commanded the space around him like gravity bent to his will, walked through the store with the confidence of someone who owned not just this market but probably the entire block. People moved aside without being asked, conversations dropped to whispers, and the store manager appeared from his office with a speed I'd never witnessed, his usual lazy demeanor replaced with something like panic mixed with deference. Mr. Castellano, the manager said, wringing his hands. We weren't expecting you today. Everything is in order, I assure you. The monthly payment was sent on time. So this was Castellano. I'd heard the name whispered among the other employees, knew that he owned the building, knew that Romano's Market paid rent to him along with several other businesses on this street. I'd heard other things too. Rumors about the family he belonged to, about business dealings that went beyond real estate, about power that extended through the boroughs like roots of an old tree, invisible but unbreakable. But rumors were just rumors, and I'd learned to keep my head down and my mouth shut about things that didn't concern me. Castellano waved off the manager with a gesture that was both dismissive and elegant. I'm not here for business. I need to speak with Elena about Sunday dinner. Where is she? In the back, sir. I'll get her immediately. As the manager scurried away, Castellano moved through the store, examining produce with the eye of someone who knew quality, picking up tomatoes and testing their firmness, smelling basil to check freshness. He was making his way toward the deli counter when an elderly woman approached him, clearly not understanding who he was, or not caring, the way old Italian women often didn't care about status or power when they had something to say. Scusi, she said in heavily accented English. You know where is the pasta fazool? I can no find it. Castellano looked at her, and something in his expression softened slightly. Pasta e fagioli, he corrected gently, switching to Italian. You're looking for pasta and beans? Si, the woman said, beaming at finding someone who spoke proper Italian. For my grandson, he love it. I'll sink, Castellano replied, pointing. But his pronunciation was wrong. He'd said cinque instead of cinque, the hard C sound instead of the soft. It was a northern Italian pronunciation. Roman, maybe. Definitely not Neapolitan. The old woman didn't notice or didn't care, thanking him and shuffling off. But I noticed because language was one of the few things I still had left from home. One of the few things that made me feel like I was still myself under the fluorescent lights and polyester uniforms. Castellano continued to the deli counter, and I heard him talking to the woman working there, Elena apparently, discussing menu plans for some family gathering. His Italian flowed easily. But again, there were pronunciations that were just slightly off, words that he was using correctly, but saying in a way that marked him as Northern Italian despite his obvious Neapolitan surnames. I should have kept my mouth shut. I should have continued scanning groceries and minding my own business and staying invisible the way I'd trained myself to do. But 3 years of biting my tongue, 3 years of hearing my language butchered, 3 years of pretending I was less educated and less cultured than I was because Americans didn't care about Italian grocery store clerks having university degrees. It all came bubbling up in a moment of frustration I couldn't quite suppress. When Castellano approached my register with a basket of items, fancy olive oil and aged Parmesan, and the kind of pasta that cost $12 a box, I began scanning without looking up, falling into the mechanical rhythm. He was on his phone, speaking rapid Italian about some business matter, and I heard him say, Domani alle cinque, tomorrow at 5. That same northern pronunciation that grated on my ears. What? Cinque, I said quietly, correcting him before I could stop myself. It's cinque, not cinque. The C is soft before an I. The silence that fell was absolute. Castellano stopped mid-sentence on his phone, his eyes shifting to me with an intensity that made my heart stop. His security guards tensed, hands moving toward their jackets. The store manager, who had reappeared from the back, made a small sound of horror. Every customer in the immediate area went quiet, sensing danger the way animals sense approaching storms. I looked up from the register, meeting Castellano's eyes for the first time, and saw something I didn't expect. Not anger, though there was some of that. Not offense at being corrected by a grocery store clerk. But surprise, sharp and genuine, followed by curiosity. You speak Italian, he said, still in Italian, his phone forgotten in his hand. I am Italian, I replied, also in Italian, feeling my face flush with embarrassment and adrenaline. From Campania. We pronounce things correctly there. One of his guards moved forward, but Castellano raised a hand, stopping him. He was studying me now with that same intensity he'd given the tomatoes, assessing quality and origin. Campania, he repeated. What part? A village outside Napoli. You wouldn't know it. No one knows it. Try me. Monteleone, I said, naming my village, the place I'd left behind with my grandmother's savings and hopes, in the hills above Sorrento. Something changed in Castellano's expression, shock flickering across his features before he controlled it. His security guards exchanged glances. The store manager looked confused, not understanding the Italian but sensing the shift in dynamics. Monteleone, Castellano repeated slowly. The village with the medieval church, the one with the Byzantine mosaic of St. Helena. My hands, which had been mechanically scanning his items, stopped. You know it. I was born there, he said quietly. My family is from Monteleone. We left when I was 7, came to America, but I was born in that village. The odds of this, of running into someone from my tiny village in the hills of Campania in a grocery store in Brooklyn, were astronomical. Monteleone had maybe 300 residents, most of them elderly. Many of the young people having left for cities or other countries. And here stood a man who clearly wielded enormous power in this city, who owned buildings and commanded fear, who was from the same impossible-to-find village that I called home. What family? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Castellano, he said. My grandfather was Tommaso Castellano. He had the small farm on the eastern side of the village, grew olives and lemons. I felt the world tilt slightly. I know that farm. My grandmother used to buy olive oil from him. He died, 15 years ago? 17, Castellano corrected. And your grandmother? Sofia Marino. She passed 3 years ago. She lived in the house near the church, the one with the blue door. I remember that house, he said, and his voice held something like wonder. I remember an old woman who used to give me cookies when I walked past. She made these almond cookies with honey. Amaretti, I said. She made them for every holiday. We stood there staring at each other, the grocery store fading away, both of us transported to a village thousands of miles away, where cobblestone streets wound through medieval buildings, and the smell of lemon trees filled the air. The other customers were staring, confused by the rapid Italian and the strange tension, but I barely noticed them. What's your name? Castellano asked. Sofia Marino. He smiled, and it transformed his face from intimidating to almost warm. Sofia Marino from the house with the blue door. I'm Antonio Castellano, from the farm with the olive trees. He paused, then added, What are you doing working in a grocery store? The question hit like a slap, not because it was rude, but because it was so direct, so honest. What was I doing working in a grocery store, with a degree in art history from the University of Naples, with fluency in 3 languages, with a mind that had once been praised by professors as exceptional? I was surviving, barely, in a country that had promised opportunity but delivered only struggle. Living the American dream, I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Making minimum wage and sharing an apartment with 2 strangers. Antonio's expression darkened. You have education? A degree. Art history. Very useful for scanning barcodes. He was quiet for a moment, studying me with that intense focus. Then he pulled out his phone, typed something, and showed me the screen. It was a photo of a painting, Renaissance era, Madonna and Child, beautiful composition and technique. What is this? He asked. I looked at the painting, and years of education came flooding back. 15th century, Florentine school. Probably a student of Botticelli based on the technique and composition. The gold leaf suggests it was commissioned by a wealthy patron, likely church or nobility. The Madonna's face has that characteristic serene quality, but the infant is more naturalistic than typical for the period, suggesting later influence. If I had to guess, I'd say this was painted between 1480 and 1490. Probably worth anywhere from $500,000 to $2 million, depending on attribution and provenance. Antonio's guards were staring at me like I'd just performed magic. The store manager's mouth was literally hanging open. Antonio himself looked impressed, which I suspected was a rare expression for him. That's exactly right, he said quietly. I bought that painting 6 months ago for $800,000. The dealer tried to tell me it was an original Botticelli worth $3 million. You just saved me from being robbed. I didn't save you anything, you already bought it. But now I know what I have. He tucked his phone away and pulled out a business card, expensive cardstock with elegant lettering. Come see me tomorrow, 10 in the morning, this address. I looked at the card, seeing an address in Manhattan, the kind of neighborhood where people like me didn't go unless we were cleaning houses or delivering food. Why? Because you're wasting your talent scanning groceries. Because someone from Monteleone should be doing better than this in America. Because I can help. There it was again, that offer I'd heard before from men who saw opportunity in young women working low-wage jobs. Help that came with expectations, with strings, with a price that wasn't spoken but was always implied. I'd turned down those offers before, maintained my pride even when it meant staying poor and struggling. I don't need charity, I said, hearing my grandmother's pride in my voice. It's not charity, Antonio replied. It's business. I acquire art, among other things. I need someone who can authenticate, appraise, and advise. Someone I can trust, which is rare in that world. Someone who speaks Italian, who understands our culture, who has the education and the eye. You need a job that uses your skills and pays you what you're worth. We can help each other. You don't know me. I know you're from Monteleone, that's enough. The village connection, the bond of shared origin, was everything in Italian culture. It was trust built on geography and history, on the understanding that people from the same place looked out for each other, especially in foreign countries. But it was also a trap, a way of creating obligation and debt that could be called in later. What kind of business are you really in? I asked, switching to English so the manager and customers could understand if they were listening. Besides real estate and art collections. Antonio's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, respect maybe, or appreciation for my directness. I'm in many businesses, some legitimate, some less so. But the art collection is completely legitimate. Museums, galleries, private collectors. All legal, all documented, all clean. If you work for me in that capacity, you'll never touch anything questionable. And if I say no, then you continue scanning groceries, and we both pretend this conversation never happened. No pressure, no consequences. But you'd be foolish to say no, Sofia Marino, and I don't think you're a fool. He was right, and we both knew it. This was opportunity. Real opportunity. The kind that didn't come along often, or maybe ever again. It was also danger, association with a man who clearly operated in worlds I didn't understand, who wielded power that came from sources beyond legitimate business. But I'd been safe for 3 years, and safety had gotten me nowhere except tired and poor, and slowly forgetting why I'd come to America in the first place. I'll come tomorrow, I heard myself say, but if I don't like what I see, I walk away. No obligations. Antonio smiled that transforming smile again. Fair enough. 10 in the morning, don't be late. He paid for his groceries, left a $100 bill as a tip that I knew I wasn't supposed to accept, but that he pressed into my hand anyway, and walked out of the store with his security guards flanking him. The store manager immediately rushed over, demanding to know what we'd talked about. But I shook my head and continued working, my mind already spinning with possibilities and fears. That night, I lay awake in my tiny corner of the studio apartment, listening to my roommate snore, thinking about the blue door of my grandmother's house, and the olive trees on the Castellano farm. I thought about how impossible it was that Antonio and I had both ended up in the same grocery store in Brooklyn, 2 people from a village so small it didn't appear on most maps. I thought about my grandmother's letter, about making her proud, about the life she'd dreamed for me that had so far failed to materialize. And I thought about what she would say if she knew I was considering working for a man like Antonio Castellano, whose surname I now remembered hearing in whispers when I was a child, whose family had left the village suddenly under circumstances no one discussed openly, whose American success was clearly built on foundations that weren't entirely legal. She would tell me to be careful. She would tell me to use my head. But she would also tell me that opportunities didn't knock twice, and that sometimes you had to take risks to build the life you wanted. The address on Antonio's card led me to a building in Tribeca, one of those converted warehouses that had been transformed into luxury spaces worth millions. The lobby had marble floors and modern art on the walls, and the doorman looked at me with suspicion until I showed him the business card. He made a call, then directed me to a private elevator that required a key card to operate. I rode up to the 12th floor, heart pounding, wondering if I was making a terrible mistake. The elevator opened directly into an apartment that took up the entire floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan, and the space was decorated with a combination of modern furniture and classical art that somehow worked together perfectly. Antonio was standing at one of the windows, phone to his ear, speaking rapid Italian about shipping schedules and customs documentation. He saw me and held up one finger, indicating I should wait, then finished his conversation and turned to face me. Sofia, he said, switching to English. You came. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't. But you did. Come, let me show you why. He led me through the apartment to a room that had been converted into a gallery. The walls were covered with paintings, some old masters, some contemporary, all arranged with a curator's eye for composition and light. There were sculptures on pedestals, artifacts in climate-controlled cases, and a large desk covered with photographs and documentation. This is my collection, Antonio said. About $30 million worth of art, all legitimate, all purchased through proper channels. But the problem is, I don't always know what I'm buying. I rely on dealers and auction houses, and they lie. They inflate values, fake provenance, attribute works to famous artists when they're really copies or student works. I've been burned 3 times this year alone, losing nearly $2 million to fraud. I moved through the room, examining pieces with the trained eye my professors had developed in me. The Botticelli painting from the photo was there, and I could see immediately that Antonio had been right to be skeptical. It was good, very good, but the brushwork was slightly too controlled, the technique too perfect. A master's work had life and spontaneity that students could rarely replicate. This isn't Botticelli, I said, pointing to the painting. But it's still valuable. This is workshop quality, probably painted by one of his senior students under his supervision. Still 15th century, still Florentine, still worth what you paid. But not what the dealer claimed. And this? Antonio gestured to a small bronze sculpture of a horse. I examined it carefully, noting the patina, the style, the weight and balance. Roman, 2nd or 3rd century AD, museum quality if the provenance is clean. Where did you get it? Auction in London. They said it was from a private collection, estate sale. Did they provide excavation documentation? Export permits? Any paperwork showing it was legally removed from Italy? Antonio's expression told me everything. You're saying it's stolen. I'm saying it might be. Classical artifacts like this should have extensive documentation, proving they weren't looted from archaeological sites. Without that documentation, this could be smuggled antiquity, which means it's illegal to own and you could face criminal charges if authorities discover it. He was quiet for a long moment, studying the sculpture with new eyes. Can you fix it? Fix what? If it's stolen, it needs to be returned to Italy. I mean, verify the rest of the collection. Tell me what's real, what's questionable, what needs better documentation. Make sure I'm not inadvertently breaking laws or supporting theft. The request was reasonable, even ethical, but it also meant diving deep into his world. Seeing things I might not want to see, becoming complicit in whatever other business dealings he had beyond art collection. I could feel myself standing at a crossroads, one path leading back to the grocery store and safety, the other leading into unknown territory with Antonio Castellano. How much would you pay me? I asked. $75,000 a year to start, full benefits, including health insurance, office space here or wherever you prefer, budget for authentication travel and expert consultations, and a 5% commission on any fraudulent pieces you identify and help me recover value from. The number hit me like a physical blow. $75,000 was more than I'd dreamed of making. More than seemed possible for someone with my background and accent and immigrant status. It was stability, security, the ability to actually save money and maybe even send more back to my cousin in Italy. Why me? I asked again, needing to understand. You could hire anyone. There are hundreds of art historians in New York with better credentials and more experience. Antonio moved closer, and I was suddenly aware of how tall he was, how he commanded space without being aggressive. Because I trust you. Not because of your credentials, though those matter. But because you're from Monteleone. Because your grandmother knew my grandfather. Because you corrected my Italian pronunciation in public, even though it was dangerous. Which means you value truth over safety. And because when I asked you about the Botticelli, you gave me the honest answer instead of telling me what I wanted to hear. You barely know me. I know enough, and you know enough about me to understand that if you betray that trust, there would be consequences. It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but it hung in the air between us. So the question is, Sofia Marino from the house with the blue door, do you want to keep scanning groceries, or do you want to do the work you were educated for? I looked around the gallery, at the art that represented history and beauty and human achievement across centuries. I thought about my grandmother, who had cleaned wealthy people's houses so I could go to university, who had saved every spare euro so I could come to America. I thought about 3 years of invisible suffering, of talent wasted, of dreams slowly dying under fluorescent lights. I want the job, I said, but I have conditions. Antonio smiled. I expected nothing less. Tell me. Everything I do has to be legal. I won't authenticate stolen art or help you acquire pieces through questionable means. If I find something illegal in your collection, I report it, and you cooperate with authorities to return it to rightful owners. And if I discover you're using me to legitimize criminal activity, I walk away immediately. Agreed. And I want 80,000, not 75. I have a degree from one of the best universities in Italy. I'm worth it. Antonio's smile widened. You are worth it. 80,000 it is. When can you start? I have to give notice at the grocery store. 2 weeks. Give them 1 week. I'll pay you for the extra week. And Sofia? He extended his hand. Welcome to New York. The real New York, not the one that tries to keep people like us invisible. I shook his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm that suggested his expensive suits didn't erase whatever work he'd done to build his empire. His grip was firm, warm, and the touch sent an unexpected jolt through me that I immediately tried to ignore. This was business, just business. Antonio Castellano was my employer, nothing more. The fact that he was attractive in that dangerous way certain Italian men could be, the fact that his intensity made my pulse race, the fact that he looked at me like I mattered, none of that was relevant. But as I rode the elevator back down to the lobby, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just stepped into something far more complicated than a job, and I couldn't decide if I was excited or terrified. The next 6 months transformed my life completely. Antonio gave me the gallery room as my office, and a generous budget to build a proper authentication system. I hired laboratory services to do scientific testing on pigments and materials, established relationships with university experts who could provide specialized knowledge, and created a database tracking provenance and documentation for every piece in the collection. I worked 12-hour days, immersing myself in research and analysis, rediscovering the passion for art that had been buried under years of survival mode. Antonio was always there, watching me work with that intense focus, asking questions, learning. Despite running multiple businesses that seemed to require his attention constantly, he always made time to discuss discoveries I'd made or authentication issues that needed his decision. We fell into a rhythm, communicating in rapid Italian that excluded everyone else, building a partnership based on shared knowledge and trust. I discovered that 23 pieces in his collection had questionable provenance, including the Roman bronze that was almost certainly looted. Antonio didn't hesitate. We contacted authorities in Italy, provided documentation, and arranged for the artifacts to be repatriated. The process was complicated and expensive, requiring lawyers and diplomats and endless paperwork. But Antonio insisted it was the right thing to do. I watched him take losses totaling nearly $4 million without complaint, and something in my perception of him shifted. Whatever else he might be involved in, his commitment to handling the art collection ethically was genuine. We also began acquiring new pieces, and this is where my value truly showed. I could spot fakes that fooled everyone else, identify undervalued works that would appreciate significantly, and negotiate with dealers in Italian that put them off balance. Within 6 months, I'd helped Antonio acquire 8 pieces worth a combined $12 million that he'd paid only $7 million for, and I'd prevented him from buying 4 fraudulent pieces that would have cost him $3 million more. The commission checks alone were more money than I'd made in the previous 3 years combined. I moved out of the studio apartment into a 1-bedroom in a decent neighborhood. I sent substantial amounts back to my cousin in Italy. I bought clothes that fit properly and shoes that didn't hurt my feet. I got health insurance and went to the dentist for the first time in years. I started to feel like a person again instead of just a survival machine. But working so closely with Antonio came with complications I hadn't anticipated. He was brilliant, I discovered, with a mind that could hold complex details about multiple businesses simultaneously, while still engaging deeply with art history and authentication theory. He was generous, not just with money but with praise and recognition for my work. And he was surprisingly vulnerable, sharing stories about his childhood in Monteleone, about leaving Italy, about building his empire from nothing through intelligence and ruthlessness in equal measures. He told me about his grandfather's olive farm one evening, as we were cataloging a new acquisition. We were alone in the gallery, rain pattering against the windows, the city spread out below us in a carpet of lights. Antonio had opened a bottle of wine from Campania, and we were sitting on the floor surrounded by documentation, both of us exhausted from hours of research. Nonno Tommaso never wanted to leave Monteleone, Antonio said, swirling wine in his glass. He loved that farm, every tree, every stone. But my father got involved with the wrong people, made choices that put the whole family at risk. We had to run, literally in the middle of the night, left everything behind. Nonno never forgave him for that. He died angry, still trying to find a way to go back. My grandmother told me about the Castellano family leaving, I said quietly, but she never said why, just that there was trouble and you disappeared. My father stole from someone he shouldn't have stolen from, someone powerful, connected, the kind of person who doesn't forgive debt or betrayal. We came to America with nothing, lived in a basement apartment in Brooklyn for 3 years. My father tried to rebuild, started small operations, but he never really recovered from the shame of it. He died when I was 15, and I was left to figure out how to survive. I'm sorry. Don't be. I learned from his mistakes. I built something that can't be taken away so easily. I built power that comes from intelligence and connections, not just force. And I made sure that when I acquired art, when I built this collection, it would be clean, legitimate, something Nonno Tommaso would have been proud of, even if everything else I do would horrify him. There was such sadness in his voice that I found myself reaching out, putting my hand over his. The touch was electric, dangerous, crossing a line from professional to personal that I knew we shouldn't cross. But I didn't pull away, and neither did he. He would be proud, I said. You're from Monteleone, we're survivors, we do what we must. Antonio looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my breath catch. Want, yes, but also need, not just physical, though that was there too, crackling between us like static electricity, but emotional need. The desire to be seen and understood by someone who came from the same place, who spoke the same language, who carried the same weight of expectations and survival. Sofia, he said quietly, we shouldn't. I know. You work for me, there's a power dynamic. If something happened between us, it could complicate everything. I know that too. But I can't stop thinking about you. Every time you analyze a painting, every time you correct my pronunciation, every time you argue with me about authentication methods, I can't stop. I should have pulled my hand away, I should have stood up, left the room, maintained professional distance. Instead, I leaned closer. Then stop trying to stop, I whispered. He kissed me, and it was like coming home and jumping off a cliff simultaneously, his hands tangled in my hair, mine fisted in his expensive shirt, and 3 years of loneliness and 6 months of building tension exploded into desperate need. We made love right there on the gallery floor, surrounded by millions of dollars of art, 2 people from Monteleone finding each other thousands of miles from home. Afterward, lying tangled together with Antonio's jacket as a makeshift blanket, reality began to creep back in. What had we done? How would this change our working relationship? What complications had we just created? I should probably feel guilty about this, Antonio said, his fingers tracing patterns on my shoulder. But I don't. I should be professional, maintain boundaries, but I've wanted you since you corrected my Italian in that grocery store. That was only 6 months ago. The longest 6 months of my life. I laughed, then sobered. What happens now? Now we figure out how to do this right. I don't want you to feel pressured or obligated. You're an employee, yes, but you're also from Monteleone, which makes you family in ways that transcend business. If you want this to be just one night, we pretend it never happened and continue working together. If you want more, we build something real, but we do it carefully, making sure your career isn't compromised. You make it sound simple. Well, nothing about this is simple, Sofia, but I learned a long time ago that the complicated things are usually the ones worth fighting for. We ended up building something real, though carefully was an understatement. We kept our relationship private for months, not hiding it exactly, but not advertising it either. At work, we were professional, collaborating on acquisitions and authentication, with the same intensity as before. But after hours, in Antonio's apartment, we were something else entirely. He showed me a vulnerability he revealed to no one else, shared fears and doubts that his ruthless reputation concealed, and I shared my own struggles, the immigrant's constant feeling of not quite belonging, the pressure of representing my grandmother's dreams, the weight of talent that had almost been wasted. 8 months into our relationship, everything exploded. Antonio's security chief, a man named Luca who'd been with him for years, was arrested on federal racketeering charges. The authorities claimed he'd been running drug distribution networks through Antonio's legitimate businesses, using the real estate holdings as fronts. Luca denied everything, claimed he'd been set up, but the evidence was substantial, and the federal investigation began expanding, looking at everyone in Antonio's organization with new scrutiny, including me. 2 FBI agents showed up at the gallery one morning, flashing badges and asking questions about my work authenticating art. They wanted to know if I'd ever suspected money laundering, if I'd authenticated pieces I knew were stolen, if I'd helped Antonio move money through art sales. I answered honestly, showed them my documentation, proved that every piece I'd worked on had clean provenance and legitimate sales records. Thank you for following this powerful story of connection, survival, and finding home in unexpected places. If you enjoyed this journey, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? Let me know.